G'day IB psychologists. In this video I'm going to explain how you can cover abnormal psychology in just 7 studies. So the studies I'm going to explain here are based on our textbooks, but the advice remains the same even if you're using a different option, a different disorder in abnormal psychology. You might be using different studies. Some of the tips and advice and the approach to minimize the studies will still be relevant. But these are based, the 7 studies I'm going to explain are based on our PTSD unit that is covered in our student's guide, but all 7 studies are included in the revision guide and the flashcards as well. Links to those in the descriptions. So just a quick refresher, paper 2 is based on the 4 options. Standard level, you have 1 option, 1 hour, you write 1 essay. Higher level, 2 options, 2 hours, 2 essays. Abnormal psychology is one of the most popular alongside human relationships, which is why I'll explain that one in this. Now, of course, May 2021, standard level, you don't have a paper 2 because of the coronavirus restrictions. At high level, you only have 1 option to cover for paper 2. That's in May 2021. So actually, you can cover all of paper 2 high level students this year with just the 7 studies. So let's look at the nuts and bolts of how the questions are going to be asked. Before we actually get to the studies and the studies we can use, we have to know what types of questions are going to be asked in the exam. So there are 3 questions per option, 3 topics per option, and 1 question per topic. This is stated exactly in the IB guide. Really, really important to know. Can't stress this enough. You have 3 topics in the option. There'll be 3 questions in the exam, 1 question from each topic. So here's an example from the specimen papers. There's a question here from question 1 is from diagnosis, question 2 is from etiologies, and question 3 is from the treatments. So what that means is you can become an expert in just one of these topics. You don't have to revise the whole of the abnormal psychology option. You probably already know that by now, but I want to make sure that that's really, really crystal clear. So what's the best topic to choose? Well, not only can the exam questions be based on the topic and the content. If that was just the case, we'd see etiology is a pretty good choice, right? Because there's only 2 content points here. These have a lot more. But they can also ask about research methods and ethics in relation to each topic. They could also ask about the biological, cognitive, and sociocultural approaches in relation to each of these 3 topics. So when you factor in all these possible exam questions, number 1, that's why it's impossible to revise all of these topics for all 3 options. So choosing 1 topic, it's not cheating, it's not taking shortcuts, it's the only way you can manage the course in the time that we have available. And so I firmly believe that the etiology of abnormal psychology is the best choice to make here. Okay, so the questions are going to be based on the explanations, the prevalence rates, research methods, ethics, and the 3 approaches. All right, so this is coming straight from the guide. The 3 examples or the 3 etiologies that I look at in PTSD are the abnormalities in the brain, including the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and amygdala, cognitive appraisals for the cognitive approach, and socioeconomic status for socioeconomic factors. Now, what these 3 things suggest, just a quick refresher of PTSD, is PTSD occurs after you experience a traumatic event. So these explanations are saying that if you have these factors, these are risk factors for developing PTSD after experiencing trauma. Because remember, not everyone goes through a traumatic event and develops PTSD. Not every car crash victim, not every person who loses someone they love, not every war veteran develops PTSD. But you're more likely to if you have abnormalities in the brain, negative appraisals, or you're from a low socioeconomic status background. So just quickly at a glance, these are the 7 studies. Again, if you're using the PTSD unit, if you're going through the course using our textbooks, these names will be familiar. But let's have a look more specifically at how we can use these. So biological explanations, cognitive, and sociocultural. So we can see here we can cover the 3 approaches and the topics, the etiology and explanations, all just by using the same content. So biological explanations in the brain, Carl et al. Is a really good meta-analysis that combines a range of studies that show abnormalities in the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala, and how they link to PTSD. We can use Gilbertson's twin study that shows that a small or reduced volume in the hippocampus is a risk factor for PTSD in war veterans. So here we have our 2 studies for biological explanations. Hitchcock is a basic correlational study that links appraisals with symptoms of PTSD. And Uri et al. Is a fMRI study that looks at how cognitive appraisals interact with activity in the brain. So that's why it's highlighted in blue here. It's a really good study to support Hitchcock's to be able to explain why appraisals can help reduce symptoms of PTSD, or why appraisals are linked to PTSD, because they're linked to activity in the parts of the brain like the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So that also means we can use those to support essays on biological explanations. Then we get into the sociocultural approach. And we see Irish et al. Was a study that compared men and women after car crashes and showed that women were more likely to get PTSD. I might be mistaking the traumatic event here with men and women. Was it Hitchcock? Hitchcock and Irish. I sometimes get the methodology confused here. But regardless, Irish et al. Found that the women were more likely to develop PTSD after a traumatic event. And the reason for the difference in PTSD levels was because of the differences in income. So we can link that to socioeconomic status. Same thing, Garrison looks at racial differences in PTSD in America. And so racial minorities were more likely to get PTSD. It's a really common finding that racial minorities are more at risk for developing PTSD after trauma. And so in the United States and in many countries, right, race is and minority status is linked to socioeconomic status. So we can use that as an example as well. And then we have Luby, which connects socioeconomic status to the brain. And so people children from a lower socioeconomic status group had smaller hippocampus, and they also had differences in their amygdala. And so that's why this is highlighted in blue as well. It can double up for this and the biological approach. So we can see through these 7 studies, we can be really well covered for any of the etiologies or explanations, questions from either of the 3 approaches. When we move into the next topic, prevalence means how common a particular disorder is in a given population. So we're going to explain prevalence in socioeconomic status. So Irish et al., Garrison and Luby, it's the same thing. We're saying that people PTSD is more prevalent in lower socioeconomic status groups. So now our explanation is pretty much the same as the sociocultural explanation. We just tweak the explanations a little bit. Okay, so same studies, but just different topics. Now we get into the more tricky questions of research methods and ethical considerations. I would suggest the number 1 research method to focus on would be correlational studies. These are really common in studies in PTSD. And because they calculate a correlation coefficient, they see how strongly is PTSD or PTSD symptoms as measured by like the CAP scale. It's a questionnaire, the clinically administered PTSD scale. It's a questionnaire that measures how severe your symptoms of PTSD are. So that gives you a score, and then that's correlated with things like the volume in your hippocampus, the activity in your PFC, maybe your scores on an appraisal questionnaire, or your socioeconomic status. And so they see how strongly these things are related. Why are they useful? Well, because it's very unethical and even practically difficult to conduct an experiment where your dependent variable is going to be some sort of symptom of PTSD, right? So we don't really want to conduct those types of experiments. Now we can do those on animals, but then PTSD is a little bit more. That gives us a very, very specific biological aspect. So it's not as valuable as these correlational studies. So that links to ethical considerations and anonymity. So if we look at these are the 3 studies I think that are true correlational studies that are really good to use for these 2 topics. And the anonymity is important in any correlational study because they typically gather really sensitive data, right? So anything on socioeconomic status, you really don't want your income or your socioeconomic status, those details published with your name on it, right? If you're measuring PTSD symptoms like they did in Irish and Hitchcock, you don't want people to know, your PTSD symptom severity score, how bad, or even if you were in the study in the first place, if you had PTSD. If you experienced some sort of trauma, you might not want other people to know about that. So this is why anonymity becomes very important. So now there is an outside chance that you ask for a second research method and a second ethical consideration. Uri et al. Is a really good example of a true experiment, and the informed consent can be the ethical consideration there. Okay, so we can see just with these, again, the same studies that we used for earlier topics can be applied here. So to review, these are the 7 studies. Now these are all covered in the flashcards and the revision book. It's just here, but I just want to show you how, with a little bit of careful planning, careful revision, you can reduce the amount of studies that you have. I just want to reiterate that the goal here isn't to see how few studies we can use. The goal is to reduce the amount of studies so you can spend more time focusing in on nuanced explanations of the disorder. So in this case, PTSD. It's about understanding what is a cognitive appraisal, what are the parts of the brain that are linked with PTSD, and why. Why do those abnormalities in the brain explain, or how can they explain symptoms of PTSD? Why are people from a lower socioeconomic status group more inclined to get PTSD? So the big mistake that most IB psychology students make is that they focus primarily on the studies and they forget the explanations. All right. So if we're looking at, explanations for disorders, prevalence rates, right, the studies are just the supporting evidence. But you have to be able to explain in detail why, from a biological, cognitive, sociocultural approach, how and why those three particular factors, brain abnormality, appraisals, and socioeconomic status, are linked with PTSD. If you're doing a different disorder like depression, I would recommend, right, choosing one good biological factor, one cognitive factor, one sociocultural factor, and becoming a real expert in that. Now, hopefully the resources that you're using, if you're not using ours, will have that, right? And so you just have to identify those specific factors. But by targeting the overlaps, by reducing the studies, reducing the content, you can spend more time revising the concepts. And you can also develop your critical thinking. And so that's going to help you write really, really good essays. In following videos, I'm going to break some of these topics down and show, okay, how could you structure an essay answer on if it was biological etiologies or prevalence rates, and I can go through some of that. But here we have it. Abnormal psychology for standard level students. That's 7 studies for all of paper 1. All right. Okay, so just a bit of a plug here, right? All of these 7 studies I made sure are in the flashcard series. Okay, and so you got detailed explanations there. And the next time, in the next video, I'm going to look at human relationships. That's the second most popular option. They are the 2 options covered in our material so far, and that can be done in 8 studies. So it's 1 extra study, but it means that standard level students, you can have the choice which one you do. High level students means you can do all of paper 2 in just 15 studies, right? 8 for human relationships, 7 for abnormal psychology. But also don't forget that some of these studies will be able to be used for paper 1. For example, Gilbertson is a twin study, right? So it can be used for twin studies, and it's about genetics and behavior, PTSD. It can be used for that as well. And so there's a lot of overlap to be had here. All right, I hope that was helpful. There's links in the description to lots of different resources and places like our blog and other things that you might find useful. Okay, I hope that helped. Good luck. If you've got questions, let me know.